I may have said it before, but sometimes on paper, a game can seem so perfect, and yet at the same time you cannot see any way a developer could make a mistake with it. South Park as a franchise is one of those IPs which you really wonder why it took them until the stick of truth to get it right. After dabbling in an awful first-person shooter and a flawed but fun game show affair, of the holy trinity of South Park N64 games, a kart-based racer should have been the surefire hit with gamers. If you think about it, kart-based races are quite straightforward to get right. All you need are fun characters, good track design, balanced weapons, and a good game engine to hold it all together. Of course, Mario Kart and Diddy Kong Racing are the two that spring to mind for fine examples, but even when you think of the lesser known kart races like Mickey Speedway USA, you still see the same basic fundamentals being put to good use. To the horror of many gamers, South Park Rally was released in early 2000 on the N64. Developed by Tantalus and published by Acclaim, it was for me personally one of the most disappointing N64 games given how much I was anticipating its release. The Australian developer may have seemed an unusual choice, as for at that time they had yet to develop a game for the N64. But with this being a multi-platform title, the focus was on getting the game on as many systems as possible rather than tapping into much of the console's specific capabilities. That's not to say that the studio didn't know what they were doing with racing titles though. Previous games in their back catalogue included both Wipeout games on the Sega Saturn, and although much of their experience was working on Sega Saturn, the ports themselves were generally well made. However, do not forget that this was their first original title. An alarm bell should start ringing when you hear that they completed the game from start to finish in just 7 months. Whilst the studio has gone on to do some incredible work even to this day, South Park Rally really wasn't the studio's breakout moment that it should and probably could have been. Jumping into the game, you'll find 3 main gameplay modes, which are Championship, Arcade or the multiplayer mode. They're all pretty self-explanatory, and for many people playing solo, you'll spend most of your time in the single-player Championship mode, where you'll work your way through a series of events with an aim of unlocking as many characters as you progress. Speaking of characters, the selection here is very good, with a large number of playable characters, each with their own unique karts, playstyles and adult humour based on one-liners. One of the highlights of the game is indeed unlocking all of these characters, and although you'll naturally find the favourite to play as, you'll at least play as the majority of the characters even just for a few times to hear their humour. I also really like the fact that the karts are designed around the characters instead of them all being very generic. For example, Jesus floats around on a cloud, Ike is in a pushchair, and Marvin is on an old school grain cart. Some characters however do just opt for the basic variations of cars, and so I feel if there was somewhat of a missed opportunity here with some of the character design, which perhaps a longer development cycle may have permitted. The game's core problems however start the moment you begin to race. When you think of kart-based races, you think of cool circuits, generally going from start to finish in a linear fashion. The reason you think of that is because of, well, the fact it's a tried and tested method which has worked perfectly well for years of gaming even by this point. Perhaps trying to think of something to make the game unique, or simply trying something new for the sake of it, the studio took the decision to make this a non-linear point-to-point racing experience. When you start the standard style races, you'll have to drive to the first point noted on the map, then on to the second point, the third point and so on. You're completely free to find your own route and path to each point, which can lead to some interesting exploration, but for the best part, this makes the game an utter mess. You have all different drivers taking different routes, directions and paths to reach the designated checkpoint. This makes it really confusing, especially when you begin the game, as you cannot simply rely on following an opponent to help with track memorization. For at least the first few attempts on each course, you'll be taking your eyes off the main screen far too often to look at the minimap in the corner to establish if you're even going in the right direction. An arrow does appear on screen from time to time, but this simply points you in the general direction. You still have to contend with the scenery and decide which routes and paths you need to take to reach it. This leaves the races themselves becoming a mess of over-the-top carnage, but not in a good way. When you throw in a hideous mix of unbalanced and uninspired weapons to the race, it makes things worse. Whilst I admit I did get some laughs out of the Terrence and Phillip fart dolls and another weapon which sees your screen covered in miniature Saddam Husseins, the general feel is that the weapons do very little in terms of the race outcome. Whilst they may give you a temporary boost, actually deciding who to attack is difficult given the structure of the races. And this is so frustrating because the developer has some really cool ideas, some of which overflow into the multiplayer mode. Using different holidays as themes for special races gives the game a welcome twist on classic multiplayer modes. Take for example the Valentine's Day theme race, which she's using Cupid's arrow with the aim of hitting all of your opponents whilst they try and do the same to you. Also look at the Kickass Mode, which plays very similarly to Mario Kart's balloon battles, albeit with small arses hovering around your cart. It's a cool variation on the classics, but no single idea seems fully fleshed out. This in a large part can be due to the game's controls. Whilst reviewers of the time were generally scathing of this, I personally didn't find them that bad, but they do take some getting used to. The handling can be very sensitive or ridiculously slow depending on your character, but the overall physics seem insane even for a cartoon-based world. On occasions your cart will feel glued to the track, and at other moments you'll be thrown through the air, so much so as grazing an object. It never seems consistent or fully tested and worked out, and it's yet another sign that the game was rushed in order to meet the pre-Christmas release on other platforms. Graphically, the game will either be something that you'll get a kick out of, or you'll think it looks terrible, and that's really down to your own personal taste. I can see why some would find the blocky textures and rough edges irritating, but I actually enjoyed the almost wacky racer style visuals. The large number of primary colours mixed in with some over-the-top colouring makes the game bright and enjoyable to look at. And also the character models, despite being in 3D, lend themselves well to the 2D source material. It's just a shame that the tracks are not as inspired. Whilst they do take some inspiration from scenes in the show, for the best part they're not very memorable and lack any sense of it being a real living world. Having residents, for example, going around South Park in the background will not only give you something extra to look out for, but also help to really inject some life into the game. Speaking of that though, the game's audio is frankly the best part of it for me. The in-game music consists of various remixes of the South Park theme with some other techno tunes which seem out of place. Thankfully though, the background music is quite low by default, because the real star of the show are the voices from the characters themselves. Not only do they frequently cuss at one another, but they seem to have a good number of lines, and so repetition is kept to a minimum. Although saying that, by the time you've completed the championship mode, you'll no doubt have tired of hearing them say the same thing over and over again, so the game is really best played in small bursts in my opinion. Either that, or turning things down in the options menu so you don't have to hear things so loudly. If you're a fan of the show, there's plenty to listen out for here, but for those that either don't know the show or simply don't like it, you'll most likely have very little interest in trying the various different ways of getting additional speech from your chosen character. Although unable to play the multiplayer mode for this review, I remember vividly the disappointment I experienced when playing it back in the day with my friends and family. I actually remember telling my old man just how good this game was going to be, and then after playing him at it for about 20 minutes, having to agree it sucked, and then sticking Mario Kart back on the console. Of course, most games of this genre are best played with friends, and so even if the single player championship mode wasn't quite for you, there may still be something for you here if you can gather enough friends and you fancy trying something a little different from your multiplayer session. Overall though, it's really hard to recommend South Park Rally even to a die-hard South Park fan. Like the first person South Park Rally comes across as a half-baked and rushed idea which never quite reaches the potential it should have. South Park was a hot craze at the time, and like a lot of crazes, the real worry was that by the time the game came out there could be little interest if the viewers had turned off from the TV show. It's funny to think of it this way, with South Park still running new episodes even to this day, but for a relatively small studio for the time, developing this game would have been a big risk and potentially disastrous for them financially and professionally if the game had failed. The strong license, when combined with the multi-platform release, helped them make the game quite profitable, but I wonder how much better it could have been if even for a few more months in development. So for today's topic of conversation, I'd love to know what you believe the worst South Park game ever made is. With Matt and Trey publicly agreeing that South Park, Chef's Love Shack and South Park Rally all pretty much sucked, I'd love to know which of the three you enjoyed the most of, if any, and also your memories of playing it back in the day or even recently. As always, sound off in the comments section down below, and until next time.